Hi, thanks. I'm glad everyone's chimed in to see my presentation here about debugging and maintaining Spring Boot applications. Again, my name is Greg Turnquist. You can follow me on Twitter. A little bit of information. I happen to write a book on learning Spring Boot that came out late last year, so some of this content's inspired by what I wrote in there, and so I hope you can find some interest in there. And if you'd like to hear about updates about either the code behind that is feeding into this or other technical stuff, be sure to sign up. Now, we have a few links here that you may want to go check out if you want to keep up with some of the Spring stuff that's coming out, either videos or Twitter action and stuff or other forums. But what we're going to talk about today is debugging boot apps, and then also building, some valuable support tools that's for your ops team, for your manager, for your manager's manager, and other things like that. And above all, how fun it is to do it with the way Spring Boot operates. Now, as we dive into this here, I have about 19 slides here, but most of this webinar is actually going to be live coding or, running stuff from my IDE and seeing how to use it. But we're going to kick things off and talk about Spring Boot applications. And if you've been using Spring Boot in the past 2 years, I'm sure you'll agree with me that the apps are really pretty awesome. There's some key aspects of bootiful applications, as Josh Long puts it, that make it really powerful and fun to build. We have auto-configured beans that, based upon class path settings, will switch on features. It's easy to take properties and externalize them and even put in profile-specific properties. So things like test platforms or production or development platforms can bend your app as needed. Things like runnable jar files are another thing. And then Boot's ability to pre-pick harmonized libraries so that stuff works together, and a lot more stuff like that. These are some of the characteristics of Boot that are really handy. And in fact, Josh Long captured it in a message that he posted at one time that said, working with Spring Boot is like pair programming with the Spring developers. So I think we all agree that Spring Boot is a really nice platform to build applications upon. But one thing that we all need to acknowledge is that sooner or later, we have trouble with apps. They break in some fashion or another. It may be when you're trying to start things up and maybe something's not configured correctly, or you run into an issue and now you're trying to figure out, what is it? Is it the code that I wrote? Is it something that's misconfigured with Boot? And at this point, things like auto-configured beans suddenly become frightening because we don't know, what did Spring do? What did I do? Was it me? Was it Boot? Is there some setting I can do? What are my options here? Years ago when the Spring framework introduced auto wiring, a lot of people were afraid of it because it seemed a little magical. But over time, people came to adopt it when they understood how it operated, and the error messages and things that came from that made it a very usable technology. And, I, for example, use auto wiring all the time. And in a similar fashion, Spring Boot has some stuff to help you in this arena when we talk about auto-configured beans. So, if you run into an issue, it would really be nice to look up what Spring Boot did in this situation. And for this, we have a couple demo apps, and we're going to start with one. And they both kind of do the same thing, but they're going to let us look at different bits of what Boot gives us to help us solve this problem. So before we get into demo mode, I want to describe what this little toy application does. It's a really tiny application, and what it simulates is devices out in the field reporting alarm status and piping from on the left-hand side, routing them through an ActiveMQ message broker into our event processing center on the right. In this case, I picked out 3 host names here. They're going to generate messages and post them, and then on the right-hand side will be a consumer receiving them on the other end. So let's get into demo mode and look at some code. So I'm going to pull it out of Keynote here, and I'm going to switch over to my IDE. And then I'm going to put this thing into presentation mode so you can actually see it. Okay, so I have a few to-dos here that I want to cover some stuff here. This is my build file. I happen to be using Gradle, and in this case, we're using Spring Boot 1.2.3. Now, amongst the list of dependencies up at the top, this is the stuff I need for my application to function. I have a Spring Boot starter. This brings a core feature set. I actually use Spring JMS because we're going to be doing both posting and consuming messages over JMS. And we're going to use things like the JMS template to do that. And on top of that, we're using ActiveMQ. Now, you notice in all three, this is the good old, I don't have to supply the version numbers because the Spring Boot Gradle plugin is doing that for me. And what's nice to know is in this supported version of ActiveMQ, it actually comes with an embedded broker model. So I don't even have to stand up a separate ActiveMQ instance. I can run it right out of the box here. But down here, there's a couple extra bits that I've added on. Now, this is not part of my functional application. This is what we sometimes refer to as non-functional stuff. And one is the Spring Boot Actuator. What it does is it serves me up what's called an autoconfiguration report, which will tell me every rule that boot kicked in when it came to configuring beans for me. And then the other piece is to actually serve it up on a web page. We need the Spring MVC web starter here. I'll need to make sure that I have comment this out because we're not ready for that yet. So what I'm going to do here is let's launch this application and take a look and see what happens. See what we're doing. Okay, it gets underway here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to pause the output. I'm going to look at what's happening, and then we're going to open up a little bit of code just to see what it's up to understand what's happening. We're running this app on Tomcat port 8080, like any standard web application. Down here, I can see that there's this little indicator here tells me that we're on VM localhost, meaning this is the sign of an embedded Apache ActiveMQ broker. And down here at the bottom, we're starting to see this traffic come out. And to see where that's coming from, I'm going to pull up some code. Now, in the earlier diagram, we saw on the left-hand side that there were three host names. Router, these, and you can see in here, router 101, multiplex 205, and switch 1143. Essentially, this little simulator is pretending to generate traffic for me. And what it's doing, it's scheduled to run this simulation every 1,000 milliseconds. So what it does is it randomly picks one of these host names. Down here, it will then randomly pick the severity of the alarm, whether it's up, down, degraded, or jeopardy, and basically puts, assembles an alarm event. And then what it does is here we have a JMS template. So it'll just ship it out over a message queue. So that's the left-hand side of that architectural diagram, generating traffic from the field. Now, on the other side of that, I have a consumer. First of all, this consumer is set up, it's annotated as a Spring component, meaning, it will automatically be picked up and activated. And then down here, I'm using Spring, I believe it's 4.1, but it could be 4.2, new at JMS listener. So this is all I need to say whenever a message comes in on this channel, run it in, deserialize the payload into an alarm event and run it into this method. Now, in this case, I'm just logging the message out to disk or out to the console, which we can see down in the log. But, this is where, in reality, you could have a fancy event correlation algorithm that could pipe traffic to the customer, can correlate alarms with customer resources and, open tickets, that kind of field processing stuff. Right now, we're just printing it out. So as it goes here, you know, it keeps generating traffic in the background, and so that's good. I'm going to let me switch out of presentation mode and go over to my browser. And I want to show you this is I mentioned earlier an auto configuration report. I'm just going to collapse this down here. But this is a web endpoint that's served up by Spring Boot Actuator. What it does is it collects every rule that gets processed through Spring Boot. These are these conditional bean definitions, a lot of them driven by what's on your class path. And here it splits them into two camps. The first one are rules that turned out true. You know, a rule that spots things like Spring MVC on the class path, so it turns on some Spring MVC configuration. These are under the positive match ones. And then rules that don't get matched, or in other words, that don't kick in and generate beans, go into the negative matches. Now, the report is actually a very compact JSON document, but I happen to have the JSON view plugin in my browser to make it readable. So if I shrink it all down but only open up the positive, I can look for things like active MQ. Let me hover over here to highlight. Here's one of the rule sets, active MQ auto configuration. And when I look at this, I can see that it had two conditions to satisfy for this rule to kick in. One was it was dependent on finding a class in the class path. In this case, looking for the JMS Connection Factory interface, and also for the Active MQ Connection Factory implementation class. So this only works essentially if you have Active MQ on your class path. It also has a condition that it says conditional on missing bean connection factory. That means that this rule only kicks in if you do not define your own connection factory. So in other words, if you don't define one, Spring Boot will define a connection factory to link up to ActiveMQ. However, if you want to go define your own connection factory, that's fine. You can declare it, and what Spring Boot will do is essentially back off and not kick this in. And so it will let you take control of the situation. And in my opinion, the backing off aspect of Spring Boot is something that is going to start to appear in lots of next generation frameworks. It's a way for frameworks to scale and respond to developer intent. You know, down here, there's another ActiveMQ based one called ActiveMQ Connection Factory Configuration, and this is some more stuff to do with connection factory. Not going to go into that. Now, right above here, there actually happens to be some more stuff here. These all, let me find a spot to pause at here so the screen can catch up. There's several here that are also tied with JMS. You know, ActiveMQ is not the only JMS broker. So we have one set of auto configurations based on ActiveMQ, but another that's totally dedicated to Spring JMS settings. You know, this one down here, JMS auto configuration pound JMS template. What this says is if there is no bean of type JMS template, Spring Boot will create one for you. Now, up above is an enclosing class that says, well, this only applies if we can detect JMS template on the class path. So if it sees JMS template on the class path, and if it sees a connection factory bean definition, then down here it will generate a JMS template unless you define your own JMS template. So that's a little bit about how to decode what this auto configuration report is showing. I'm going to go back to presentation mode in the IDE, and let me go pull up that JMS auto configuration class that we were just talking about. So here we can actually read the same thing. These are the, here we go. So this says this configuration doesn't kick in unless it can see JMS template on the class path and that there's a bean of type connection factory. Down here is here's that bean down here that says if there's no JMS, if this bean is missing, a JMS template type bean, it will define one for us. So, this gives us, we have, essentially what it's telling us is we have options here. We can plug in our own connection factory if we want. Boot will back off that part. We can plug in our own JMS template if we want. Boot will back off on that part. So that's one degree of granularity to go in and do stuff. But another option is that Spring Boot has this amazing property support. So sometimes you don't want to override an entire bean definition just to change one parameter inside it. Now, what I'm going to do is exit presentation mode. Now, so far we've been running this app with the embedded broker mode. Okay, did I already stop it? Okay, yes, I did. All right. Oh, wait, this is the wrong one. Let me get to the other one. Okay. Let me stop this instance here. So, I'm sorry. Let me relaunch it, exit full screen mode, and then let's go look at property settings. So we just looked at an auto configuration report. We saw some stuff that had kicked in. We went and were able to actually look up what the code was thanks to the power of open source. Now we can actually look at another endpoint, config props. If I search for ActiveMQ, I'm going to find this one down here. This shows some property settings that we have the ability to override. You'll notice the prefix is spring.activemq, and then underneath is a list of independent properties. So we can use spring.activemq, and if we look at the last property, it says in-memory true. What that is telling us is we have options. We can override the in-memory one and say, no, I don't want to use in-memory. I want to use a standalone broker. Let me switch that. It's an opportunity to switch it to false. If we're running a standalone broker and it's on a different URL, maybe a non-standard one, we can go plug that in. We can plug in other settings to override it. So in this case, I'm going to stop the app. Let me go back to presentation mode for this. Keep it readable. If I can open it up here. So here, all I need to do is change this one property to false. And let's see here. What I need to do is check if I'm running ActiveMQ. Okay. Down, I was making sure it's down so I can then start it up again. So here's where I'm going to run a separate ActiveMQ standalone server. So now if I start this thing up, it gets going just like it was doing that before. Some initial startup stuff. So oops, clicking the wrong thing here. Okay. So we see some action. Let's go back and look at that property setting that we just saw. Now we can see in-memory false. And so what this is telling us is that it's no longer using the in-memory settings. If I look back at that console in presentation mode here, if I pause let me pause this output and back up to the beginning where it launched. We can see the same thing. It's Tomcat running on port 8080, but if I look in the same area down here that I saw before, I no longer see that connected to VM localhost, which was the indicator for a in-memory embedded ActiveMQ broker. So instead, we can tell that it's talking to our external broker. And that way, with a single property setting change, we're able to go in and tweak the settings there. And what's even more valuable is we also got insight into other property settings that we could Okay, let me get out of this and go back and look here and point out, there's other property. We can change the broker URL, the password. We can configure it for if we need a pooled set of connections, which is often a recommended case in production, or, define user parameters if there's security on the broker. All these can be configured through injectable properties. Now, one question that may arise is well, what's the benefit of this? Can I just go to the reference documents that are for Spring Boot here and, do some searching to find out like, oh, okay, well, this tells me everything I need to know right here. Why do I need to go through all that? Or if I search, further down in the documents, I can find these other property settings right here. Well, the risk in that is that, the documents are very good, but sometimes documents and the version of you're using may not be in sync with each other. One may be out of date. You may be looking at the wrong document. And one thing that the documents can never accommodate is people are starting to write third-party libraries with Spring Boot auto-configuration built in. So somebody else's property settings aren't going to appear in these documents. But I can guarantee you any auto-configured rule will show up in that auto-config report, and any property, whether it's from Spring Boot or somebody else's module, will definitely show up in here. I feel like this would, encourages people to actually use a similar approach of taking key settings and externalizing them through property settings. So we can make it easier to manage applications. Okay, now one other bit of code that I want to look at here is so far we've talked about auto configuration, a report, and then we've also talked about configuration settings. There's another bit of non-functional features that come with Boot, and that is health checks. Now, Spring Boot comes with a built-in, basically up-down check. Essentially, when the app is running, you can poll /health and you'll get an up message. You can actually write custom health checks to go interrogate key parts of your system and return the results back to Spring Boot Actuator, and it will appear at the same place. In this case, I wanted to write a check to make sure that the active MQ broker is up and running. So to do that, I need to declare a bean. In this case, I'm going to have it picked up by auto wiring with the Spring component thing, annotation. It has to implement Spring Boot Actuator's health indicator interface for it to be recognized. Now, to do my check, I need a handle on the JMS connection factory. So in here, I'm using the well-tested constructor injection with auto wiring. So this way, when the component gets created automatically by the Spring's dependency injection container, it will give me a copy of the connection factory. Then when I actually come along and do the health check, it's going to basically try to do this call, factory create connection. So if it's not able to make a connection, it'll throw a JMS exception. And in this case, I can return status down with a copy of the exception. However, if this check works just fine, then I can return an alternative message. In this case, I can return a status up message, and I can throw in detail. In this case, you can return a status up, and you can add as many attributes as you want to describe your situation. For this one, I just have a single text message, and it says the broker was successfully reached. Sometimes in these kind of status messages, people will embed more critical details like IP addresses, or they may indicate usernames like what user is the system running under. Some of this data can be deemed as security-sensitive data. So actually, by default, when you go look up the health status, all you get is the up or down message to tell you whether or not the system is up. It aggregates all the messages, and so if everything is up, it gives you a blanket up statement. But for this demo, I wanted to actually show all the bits of health status at once, so I went in and told it to say, no, health data is not sensitive, set it to false, and show me everything. So let's go look at that indicator first in the browser, and then we're going to go look at some of this stuff through another interface. So if I go to this health endpoint, this is the aggregate message up here, status up. And if that other flag was not there, that's all that I would get, would be status up, unless the user authenticates with a management-approved user ID and password. Then you're able to get the details. It appears boot has another default health status indicator down here called disk space, and then we see the one that we just looked at a moment ago. And there we see status up, broker successfully reached. So in this sense, it took me not 10 lines of code, perhaps, to write a custom health check. So, when you go into the land of microservices and things like that, and you need to start checking a lot of different bits and pieces to make sure everything is up, this becomes a very easy tool to do that with. Now, talking about status checks, so far we've been doing web checks. This is, for instance, this endpoint's really handy when your system administrator or your ops team comes to you and says, I need to ping your app and tell if it's up. I need to put a green box up on this panel and indicate whether your app is running. And you say, all right, curl/health on my app, and that will tell you the story. So they can do that, but sometimes people use other mechanisms. One example is JMX. JMX has been around for a long time. I don't see it heavily used, but there are some shops that do that. So Spring Boot Actuator actually comes pre-built with support to talk to it. Let me make sure I'm talking to the right instance. Yes. So what I've launched here is JConsole. JConsole comes out of the box with any Java installation. Now, one thing I'm going to point out is JConsole, I don't have presentation mode for it, so you can go ahead and use your WebEx zoom option at your end if you want to try to zoom in and see what I'm doing. I'm not going to do a lot of stuff here, but I'm just going to point out that it's available. If I go into Spring Boot endpoints, like here, I can see this health endpoint. It says, there's health endpoint. If I look at the operations, there's a get data button over here, and if I hit that, I'm going to widen this out here. I can kind of see the same data that I was seeing on the web page. Let me put the web page in the background and put these two side by side. So I can see the status up, I can see this active MQ message, and I can see disk space. It's not necessarily in the same format, but somebody can use JConsole to take a peek, or because it's over a standardized API, the JMX API, you can write a Java app to connect directly to Actuator's JMX endpoint, and you can consume this data and do whatever you want to with it. I'm going to close that and point out that all the endpoints that we were looking at are also available here. We looked at the auto configuration report, and I can do the same get data operation and find it here. I mentioned about a compact report, and this is it. It's stuffed into the positive matches and negative matches, and so you have to go in and digest all this stuff here, but all the material's there. We're looking at configuration properties report is the name of that endpoint. So, we can still see all the stuff here. It's just in another format. It's another option for you to pick from. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to flip back to the slides here. Hit play. So as a quick recap, we're looking at Spring Boot Actuator, and what it gives us out of the box. It gives us an auto configuration report that tells us what rules matched, what rules did not match. We have a health check, which gives us an opportunity to plug in our own checks. I think Boot has several, like it'll ping databases and things like that, but we wrote an active MQ broker check. You can look at property settings. We also have the opportunity to put custom application information at /info. I didn't pull that up, but we'll do that in a moment. You can put fixed information like, the URL of, support website. It's also possible and you can look it up in the reference documents to generate some property data that has your Git commit ID, the version that the app was built with. So people can look up, hey, my app broke, this is the version I'm running. If I go to this info endpoint, like it says, here's details about my app, one golden nugget to add here would be a commit version number. What version of the app are you running? So that I don't have to waste 3 hours figuring out that you're running a 2-week-old version and the issue you're seeing is already patched. Now, we talked about things like debugging stuff and, being able to figure out what happened with auto configuration reports, being able to look up property settings that we can override, and writing some health checks. And what we're starting to cut over to are the features that we need to support the ops team. And Spring Boot comes with a lot of support for that. Some key pieces of that include metrics. We want to collect data on what's happening in different fashion. For that, we're going to switch to a slightly altered version of the demo. It's the same problem space, but I'm going to stop this instance running. Okay, shut that down. Okay, that is out, and I'm going to close that one so I don't bump into it again by accident. Let me put this back into presentation mode, and I'm going to show what I mean by that. Let's see here. Okay, we're essentially looking at the same consumer, the same code that was on the right side of that architectural diagram that's consuming messages that came through JMS. However, what we're introducing here through constructor injection is Spring Boot Actuator's counter service. There's a repository of metrics that collect things like counters, gauges, other things. Counters are you increment counters. They can go up by one. There may be an option to increment it by more than that, but you can increase and decrease counters. And essentially, since this is an auto-wired component, I'm going to, I don't have to actually create this bean. Spring Boot Actuator goes ahead and creates it for me. So that down here, this is the same code earlier of processing event, but now I'm going to add a couple steps here and say, increment this metric. And here I'm on the fly defining a metric called messages.total.consume. So every message I get will cause this to increment. I'm also defining another counter, only this one is messages, but it plugs in the actual event host name consumed. And this way, it'll take the message counts and split them between the host name. And this will tabulate it up. I'm going to pause and exit Slack here, just to not disturb us anymore. Okay, so that's what is on the right side. We're going to count what was consumed. Now let's look at the left-hand side, this simulator that's generating traffic. Up at the top, I have another counter service object, and I've plugged it into the constructor call here. And down at the bottom, we have this is our code we had all along to send the message out over JMS with a JMS template. But here I've added a couple increment operations on the production side. So here we have messages.total.produced, and then we also do the same, break it out by host name. Okay, now we're all set here. Let's fire up this version of the demo. Get it going. Okay, pause the output. At a glance, same sort of thing, running on Tomcat port 8080. Traffic. We see the same simulated traffic being generated. we're going to do is go over to the browser and look at the metrics endpoint. So here we actually have a lot of metrics already predefined by Spring Boot Actuator. So if we look down here at the bottom, we can see the custom ones that we just talked about down here. So we can see that multiplex 205, consumed and produced, the router 101, consumed and produced, the switch, and then the totals. And here we can, we can sit there and refresh it. And some of the stuff you notice down here, there's also counters for this one right here is telling us when we hit endpoint metrics and we get a 200 code, which is hitting the web page we're looking at, this page has been loaded up 4 times. In this case, we're talking about, plugging in some custom counters. Counters increment and decrease. What gauges do, a gauge has a fixed value, and every time you update a gauge, you update it with a new value. So it's like looking at a gauge on a car, where at any one time you're looking at what's the current readout of that. Am I driving at 50 miles an hour? Am I driving at 80 kilometers an hour? That kind of thing. The gauge is always updating itself to some value, and in that situation, you may not be as interested in what it was 5 minutes ago. So you can inject both counter services and gauge services to do that. Now, by default, Spring Boot Actuator is writing this stuff to an in-memory instance, an in-memory metric repository. So essentially, it writes it locally, and it's very handy to get going. But when you run into situations like deploying it to production and having 4 instances, you're going to have each instance is going to have its own metrics. A common situation when you start talking about 12-factor applications and production is you want all 4 instances to pipe this metric data to a third-party collector. And in this case, Spring Boot Actuator actually has a Redis metric repository. So it's possible to, in your application, you can go define a Redis metric repository bean, and you can qualify it with a profile that when you go to cloud deployment, use the Redis metric repository instead of the in-memory one, and then all instances are going to bind with that instance of Redis that you link to it. Spring Boot has a metric repository auto-configuration. And based on what we've learned in looking at auto-configuration settings, when I look at this thing right here, this says that here's a configuration, a bean definition, in this case, a single bean, an in-memory metric repository, and it only happens if there is no metric repository. So if nobody has defined any metric repository, create this. So if you go create a Redis metric repository, when you deploy to cloud, it will make boot back off of this one and use the other one instead. But there's other options. You can define your own implementation of the metric repository interface and have that kick in and write your stuff to a database with Spring Data. Or you can write it out over a channel to some external third-party thing. Now, the last thing I want to get into here is what we call crash support. Crash is an interesting name. Crash is a remote shell tool that you can link up to your application. What it does is it comes with several commands and metrics and features out of the box, but Spring Boot Actuator adds support to write your own commands. And in this case, we're going to write some ones for ActiveMQ. I'm going to close this box down here. So this is the whole code for my ActiveMQ command that I'm going to register with Crash. I'm going to talk about what this does, and then we'll actually go log into Crash, which is attached to our running application, and see what it looks like. This code is all written in Groovy, so it's real terse. Now, because these turn into commands, we defy some of the standard Java formatting rules. Like, notice this class is all lowercase. That's because this is a primary this is going to be registered as a primary command, and I don't want to be typing mixed case on the command line. Now, each of these function definitions are, what I would call a subcommand. So we're going to define ping and metrics. You notice it's flagged as a command. Each of these gets access to the invocation context, and this means we can look up about anything we need. In this case, we have access to fetch a Spring Bean factory, and that's the ticket to looking up any Spring Beans. So down here, I'm going to fetch the connection factory and basically do the same check that I showed in that other Java code, only here it's doing it in a different, it's doing a create connection call, but instead of returning a health indicator, it just returns a plain string, broker is up. But if it throws an exception, return broker is down. Down here is my other subcommand metrics. So in this case, I'm going to fetch the bean factory and fish out the metric repository. What this does is this lets me get a hold of all the metrics at once. In this case, I'm going to use a little groovy collection magic, find all metrics, iterate over them, and if the metric name starts with counter.messages, let's just print the name and the value out to screen. Now, it's possible here to use a groovy find operation now that as I'm reading this to kind of merge these two ops together, but I'd still assert this is a nice, efficient way to write some small support commands. I believe the whole thing's running, so I'm going to exit presentation mode and go over to my command line and log in to Crash. Now, what Crash does is it lets us log in by SSH, and its default is to run on port 2000 on the machine. And I believe it only, by default, supports local access. Now, I'm logged in, and I'm looking at the Crash, and I'm going to type help. What it's going to do is list all the commands that are available. There's a lot of built-in commands that you can explore that could be a whole session in and of itself, but I'm just going to go look at the ActiveMQ command that I defined. So here it gives me a readout saying, well, you have this metrics command and a ping command. And this is where the at document or the at usage annotations allow me to control the information that's posted here. So, in one fell swoop, I was able to put both metric data and health data all into one root command ActiveMQ and get a readout on this stuff. If I shut down the broker, I can go back here, do another ping, and now it tells me the broker's down. So, it's just another way to get a readout. If I start ActiveMQ back up, I can check now it's back up. So let's recap these non-functional features that we have. We have an auto-configuration report. We wrote some custom health checks. We had application information, custom metrics, custom crash commands to mix stuff together. In fact, there's even more than that when it comes to non-functional. And, well, that's a good point. Maybe I should stop saying non-functional. I'm going to actually confess to you, I've never really liked the expression non-functional because it sounds like it doesn't do anything. And to me, this stuff does a lot. So I prefer referring to these things as like op support features instead of non-functional features. So the code that you write to support, your business functionality, those are your business needs. And then these tools help support op stuff. One thing, we talked about, like, for instance, putting metric stuff in. In this example, it was very simple and contrived. There were only 2 points of message traffic happening, so, it was hand-coded. In a real production system, I would look at using something like Spring's aspect-oriented programming support and possibly writing a piece of advice to hook in, tap into key points where I want to collect metrics on the data that's flowing through the system. And then, in in a production environment, if I have, if I've scaled up to 4 instances or 100 instances, I would like to bind that to a Redis service and pipe all the metrics into that solution there and be able to go analyze it after the fact. But with Spring Boot and all the support, it's very easy and fun to go build this stuff without doing a lot of low-level plumbing. So to put a wrap on things, I did want to remind everybody there's still time to sign up for Spring 1 2GX this September, which I'm going to be speaking at it about Spring Data REST. Data meets hypermedia plus security. So I'd encourage everybody to sign up if possible. And with that, we conclude our presentation. We'll see if Peter's got any questions for us.
Yeah, definitely. Bunch of stuff coming in from the audience. So a number of people, I think you addressed this throughout the course of the presentation, but I just want to make sure. A couple people were thrown off by your sort of VM : //localhost. And everyone thinks that you were referring to the internal ActiveMQ broker with that URL syntax. Is that correct?
Yeah, that is ActiveMQ's noted. They have a broker URL, and if you're using embedded, that is the format when they specify the embedded internal broker. It's VM : //localhost. But
okay, so that's that in-memory flag that you were setting, right?
Yeah, you go in and set when you flip-flop the in-memory flag. That's what it will configure. It will configure the embedded broker, and the embedded broker, that's the URL that it uses as an indicator of that. What Spring Boot does is if you flip the flag to false, so don't use in memory, it will try to go guess what it should connect to, and it'll default to its standard port number and go looking for it there. But if you stand up ActiveMQ and you're using a non-standard port, or it's on another machine, not on localhost, then you will have to configure the broker URL property directly to tell it where that instance is.
Got it. Okay, thanks. So that was one question. Let's see. Carol asks let's see. Yeah, okay, sorry, that was the same question. She was asking about the ActiveMQ thing. Christopher Smith was asking if does that connection get closed automatically? I'm not sure what specifically he was talking about at that moment in time. It was about 10:30. It was about 10:26. So I think we kind of lost the context on that one a little bit. But
well, I'm going to hedge all of this and say that my mechanism here was I was using ActiveMQ as the means to demonstrate some configuration settings. I was killing and restarting an app, which may not be the cleanest way to detach from a broker configuration. So, if you're going to stop and start things or shutting down the broker the way I did in the middle of things, it raises the idea of, were any messages lost there? Were the messages supposed to not be lost? How do you hedge against that to where, the broker's down, let me stockpile the messages until the broker's back up? None of that's covered in the context of the demo I was doing, and is something you need to design for. It's the same kind of thing to look at if you were to use RabbitMQ. You have to evaluate that kind of stuff, or whatever you're using in your application. You can find with the auto configuration report the bits of code that Spring Boot uses to activate automatic beans for you.
Awesome. Okay, cool. Let's see. Mark asks, hey, Greg, you don't specify the version numbers in the Gradle file. How do you know what versions of the libraries are used then, and can you override it? Can a used version automatically change behind your back? Like, for example, if a new version of the library is released?
That is a great question. Let me see here. I'm going to have to keep it out of presentation mode because it won't show this stuff, but I'm highlighting that. I'm trying to tell you what you're seeing here. At the top is where I specify Spring Boot Gradle plugin, and this one has a version number. This is 1.2.3.release. This version of Spring Boot comes with a predefined set of versions for these particular dependencies down here. So in my IDE, I can scroll down and see exactly which versions it pulled in. I'm highlighting the Spring Boot starters. They all have 1, 2, 3 release on them. But down under the hood, I can glean that, like here is it's using Spring Framework 4.16 release. You know, and with that, it picks the other dependencies up. But you're at, you know, this is sort of the default situation, but you can actually go in and override a property setting, or sorry, override a version number. You know, if I wanted to change it, I can do that. And there's a different way to do it if you happen to be using Maven. So I'm going to tweak the Gradle file there and change the Spring Boot Actuator to be 1.2.2 release instead of 1.2.3. And if I give it a second here, let's see. Now here's where I may be slightly mistaken on how to tweak property. I know how to change the property numbers very easily with Maven. In Maven, you're able to override it through a property setting. But I would have to go look up precisely how that is done with Gradle. So in a Maven configuration, there's basically a property setting for each of those things. Like there's a Java version setting for boot. You know, this is a totally different app than what we're looking at, but there's a property called Spring Helios.version because this app is using Spring's Helios project. And here I can plug this in to change the version that Boot's going to use. And there's a property for each of the key libraries, but I'm not up to speed on how to override that flag in Gradle, but it should be mentioned in the reference documents. And the version numbers are not going to change under the hood because that's part of Spring Boot's release. The only time that would be an issue is, you know, so here's where the version numbers pick. You can go look up this version in GitHub. There's a tag on 1.2.3 release, and you can look up exactly what the version numbers are that go with that. The only time they're going to change is if you happen to be using a snapshot release and they could be fumbling with the versions. If I zoom in, button here, zoom in on this a little bit.
Perfect. Yeah, it looks good.
Spring Boot dependencies, pom.xml. This is where all the version numbers and their property overrides are defined. You'll notice, you know, this is a fixed thing, and so when you have a specific pinned version, the numbers aren't going to change under the hood.
Right. Yeah. Boot's sort of bill of materials is going to hand you a specific cut of things. Right. Mm-hmm. Right. It's not going to get squirrely on you unless there's a new boot release, or, you know, maybe if you're using the Spring IO platform, Maven bill of materials. You know, that's another indicator, that's another opportunity for the version numbers to potentially be different. But yeah. Yeah. Yep. Yeah. Cool. Okay. I think we got that. Christopher Smith asks, you know, warning, possibly off topic, but hey, is there any way to get crash on Cloud Foundry, on a Cloud Foundry application? I think that's an interesting question. I don't know if you have any insight into that one. I know I don't, but I've not had
a tunnel like that, so I haven't tunneled that because I realize it should, if you were to upload this app to Cloud Foundry, it should be running, but I don't know. You would have to have that port exported to the outside.
Oh yeah, no, that won't work yet. Then there's an upcoming release with the Diego release. We will be supporting SSH so that you can do port forwarding, and that would allow you to use crash.
Yep, that's a good thing. And because always when you're trying to SSH into your production system, there's always double check that that's the right solution you want to do.
Yeah. Yep. Well, we all need to sometimes troubleshoot configuration mismatches between dev and staging and production. So there's that. But yeah, interesting. So Chris, hopefully that kind of answers. Hopefully that addresses your question there. Couple of other questions. Actually, a lot of other questions. So Ram asks, how do you start and stop a boot application via the configuration?
Okay, there's actually a shutdown endpoint. Let me switch those. Okay, let me see. Where is that? Yeah, there's an endpoint you can curl against. This is where they're talking about these endpoints that I mentioned, and we saw them. Like, we looked at autoconfig, we looked at config props, we looked at health, we looked at info, we looked at metrics. There's another endpoint called shutdowns that you can send a request to. It is disabled by default. It's probably for several reasons. You don't want to accidentally open the way for people to kill your app. But you can enable it, and there's also the option to have all these are called management endpoints. There's an option to have the management endpoints also protected by Spring Security with a username and password that the admins would have. So the recommendation is, if you are going to have this turned on, you want it protected behind security so people can't ask it. But once the application is shut down, then there's nobody to send a request to start it up. So in that case, you have to fire up. Either you're going to have to launch the app yourself, on the command line, or if you're using something like Cloud Foundry, then you have stop and start buttons from inside the.
Greg, I'm going to stop you for 1 second. Sorry, one or two people are asking for a brief description of Cloud Foundry. So for anyone that's unfamiliar, Cloud Foundry is a platform as a service. What Greg is showing you right now is the console for Pivotal Web Services. That is a instance of Cloud Foundry that we run on top of Amazon Web Services. That's sort of our public cloud. You might compare it to a Heroku or something like that. It has excellent Spring support, excellent Spring Boot support. Just a fantastic Java build pack experience. And this is a platform as a service. You as a developer basically are, you tell Cloud Foundry how many instances you want and how much memory you want, and it will create a fleet of managed virtual machines or Linux containers that will, manage your application lifecycle for you. Tons more than that, but go check it out at pivotal.io. There's an overview of Cloud Foundry there. Sorry about that, Craig. I just wanted to
it's fine.
level set so that people weren't lost if they didn't know what it was.
So you can't go make a web request to an app that's not running. So in this case, here this is my demo app that's going to be at Spring 1, and it's running on Pivotal Web Services. And, here I have a stop button or a restart button, and I can start it up because it's my instance in the cloud, to run this app. So if you come and sign up, you get to find out how to post your own pictures from your iPhone, take pictures of cats and put it on the web like everyone else does. So we got another question.
Oh yeah, sorry. I was just cut and pasting some answers into the chat window. Okay. Let's see. The guy that was asking about the start and stop boot application also was commenting that app.properties sort of has a toggle. But anyway, Christopher Smith's question earlier about the connection getting closed automatically, that was regarding the health indicator. He was saying that, hey, it checks whether it can open a connection and then returns up or down. And he was curious if that connection gets closed automatically. Do you happen to know that one?
Actually, that's a good question. I would actually have to look at the semantics of it, but that's actually something to ensure you're doing proper resource management, and I did not actually look heavily at that. Oops.
Okay, so to be...
you could say arguably I need to...
Right, but boot, you're potentially adding something here to clean up the connection. So that's something. Yeah. Okay, got it. So you would have to attend to that programmatically yourself. Boot doesn't automatically clean up that connection.
No, Boot's really not aware of this custom code. That you'd have to make sure that you close that kind of stuff. If I guess because theoretically it's only going to clean it up if it properly goes out of scope.
Right.
I suppose. So that's a good question. Are you doing proper resource cleanup? So I would.
Okay.
I would go check and make sure to do that correctly. So you have a good point on that.
Okay. Excellent. Let's see. Mohammed asks, how does the ping and metrics options appear on the shell for ActiveMQ?
Okay. Let me pull that script up. Basically, okay, this script is located in source main resources /commands. So step one is, let me exit out of presentation mode so I can see the project view. So this is the path where it needs to be. Any Groovy file down here underneath the commands folder, in this case academq.groovy, will be scanned by boot to be linked with the crash support. And then on top of that, it probably will just grab it if it's class stuff, but it needs to see like the at command annotation flags this method as actually being a command. This way, you can define, you may need other methods, et cetera, in here if it gets more complex, but this is where you define the text material that is showing up there with these annotations. And finally, it comes with some built-in man pages for each command. And there's a lot of details on how to write this code in the reference documents, but these are piecing it together from the reference documents is one thing, but being able to see an actual assembled example, I think, is really nice. And this is code I lifted right out of chapter 3 of my book.
Awesome. Got it. Okay. Jalesh asks, hey, is there a preference for deploying as a jar as opposed to a war in production? And if so, why? This is the fat jar question, I think. Yeah,
there's a growing interest in using Uber jars, whatever, essentially, which in this case, Spring Boot has its own loader. The jar standard itself from Java doesn't support runnable jars, which to me has always been weird. So Spring Boot puts a jar loader in there, and it puts in each dependency as a jar file itself. I've seen other Uber jar solutions unpack jar files and put all the class files in there, and you may be at risk of overlap stuff, and or you might be at risk of license violation. But to bundle up the jars, I think, is handy. But war files are really aimed for one thing and one thing only, and that's to deploy to containers, to app servers, or they can deploy it to Tomcat. But jar files are really designed to work anywhere when you use them with boot. It's just a Java jar, myapp.jar. So I think a lot of people have adopted that, and when you use tools like Cloud Foundry, it's very easy to go. You can push a jar up there, and it may look like it's about the same thing, but war files typically tend to be associated with containers. But it is possible to make an executable war file, but the default position of boot is when you use the Spring Boot plugin, whether it's Maven or Gradle, it will build you an executable jar file.
Cool. Sorry, I got stuck on mute there for a second. Let's see. Question from Watson. He was asking, how does Cloud Foundry add to boot? And I was in the middle of responding. I was just basically telling him that, Cloud Foundry provides a kind of a public or a private cloud deployment environment, deployment platform for your Spring Boot apps. And in fact, with the Spring Cloud connectors, there's actually boot auto configurations available for you for Heroku and for Cloud Foundry services. So if you're writing an app that is going to get deployed on those platforms and you're looking to actually use services that are surfaced through the platform, much like you would, a JDBC connection pool, surfaced through a container, or an old school through an app server, that Spring Boot actually provides auto configurations for those services. So there's a lot of value in Boot specifically on Cloud Foundry in terms of making it easier to work with platform provided services and such. I don't know, Greg, if you want to add to that at all, but
there's another feature that's really powerful, and it's called the Spring Profiles. It's possible to put an app profile annotation on a bean, on a app configuration class, and you can have beans only activate when you turn on certain profiles, and you can turn on more than one profile. When you deploy an app, if it's a Spring application, if you push it up to a Cloud Foundry instance, whether it's your private copy or you're pushing it up to our public Pivotal Web Services, they automatically put a cloud profile on your app. So it's very easy to say, well, I need this bean to kick in when you go to the cloud, so I'm going to put app profile cloud on it. And that's an example where, like I was saying, you could use the Redis metrics repository and conditionalize it that only create this bean when it goes to the cloud, and then I just need to be sure that my deployed instance gets bound to an instance of Redis. But there's also a guide we have here. If you go to the spring.io/guides and search for Lattice, what Lattice is Lattice is Cloud Foundry with some of the multi-tenancy features removed from it. It's sort of, you could say it's lightweight on requirements, but it's still very powerful. And it's one way to basically run the gist of Cloud Foundry like on your laptop, but it'll run in other places. And this guide actually is sort of an intro to using these Spring Cloud tools that you were just talking about. It's not very long to run them on Lattice. And, once you get into the cloud story, there's a whole bunch of talks that are going to be at Spring 1 to talk about all the components of Spring Cloud to make, microservices and multi-unit solutions out there in the cloud work together better to discover each other and to do things like that.
So interesting related question. Glenn Lingle asks, does Spring Boot have support for high availability with another machine running for failover? And I would say, not really. No. I mean, the design point of Spring Boot is to be an ultra light, container, for microservices, as Greg was just speaking about. But the idea is that if you go too far in that direction, you're going to end up with if you go too far in that direction, you're eventually get hundreds of monkeys sitting at a keyboard, and you'll end up with IBM WebSphere, right? And because you want to sort of, in the cloud era, I think you kind of want to delegate high availability to the platform that you're running under, as opposed to build that into the app container. I don't know, Greg, what your comments are, but those are mine.
Yeah, HA stuff is sort of outside the scope of Boot. You can talk about things like Oracle clusters or PostgreSQL clusters or something that you're talking to, and that was something that you'd be setting up outside. And so in your database configuration, you would configure your Boot app to point to the load balancer for that cluster. And so Boot doesn't need to know anything about that. Other people have HA requirements where they need session replication between multiple instances of Tomcat. Tomcat has support for doing some of that stuff, but like one of their session replication features uses multicast. And if you ever take multicast into an ops center, you're going to be chased out of there because nobody likes multicast. Because I've seen people stand up multicast solutions, and it gets out of their data center and takes out 800 different data centers because somebody didn't understand what they were doing. So the modern cloud solution is you take your Boot app and you push it up to Cloud Foundry and you spin up 5 instances, and Cloud Foundry handles the load balancing for you. It gives you a URL to talk to, whether it's their out-of-the-box one or your registered domain, and then it does all the load balancing inside the cloud provider. And so you don't need to go fiddle around with that kind of stuff. And then
exactly,
you can also stand up, you can bind to a database service and you let it handle the high availability requirements. and then you don't need to deal with that from an application.
But if you are stuck at a company that's working on kind of crufty app server stuff, then you're okay. Then you can run boot on an app server, right? And that app server can provide some HA and failover stuff for you at that level if that's the environment you're working in. So you can kind of go at it either way. And you can talk to a cluster database server with no problem. You just point it to the load balancer, or you can go in and configure this embedded Tomcat server if that's what you happen to be using. We pick a lot of default settings, so you don't have to, but you can go in and declare all the settings for Tomcat if needed, and turn on that multicast session replication if that's what you need. Because I have a demonstration on how to turn on HTTPS on Tomcat and have HTTP redirect you to the SSL port of that container automatically, but that's something you have to do by hand. Yep. Excellent. Yeah. Last question, I think, from Glenn Lingle as well. Is there a way to change where the commands are, like at a specific place on the file system? I think he's talking about either the CLI or the crash. I'm not sure.
If he's talking about the, like you're talking about where this file goes, I'm not sure if that's what the question is. But
oh yeah, he's just clarifying now over the chat window, and he is saying crash commands. Sorry.
So I think the code has to be here. I'm not sure if that's overwritable yet. Let me see where it's got. Yeah,
okay.
What it has here is this is the default, is where it's going to look for stuff for commands, but you can override it with a pattern by setting this property in application.properties.
I see. Okay.
Just about everything in boot that has a setting to it has been propertyized so that it can be overridden. So I mean, you can override where application.properties is located or what the name of that properties file is even. So.
But this, I think this really helps, for people who might be seeing boot for the first time and are going, oh my God, like what just happened? And they're having a hard time understanding, some of the magic. This is a lot of great techniques to be able to get boot to tell you what it's doing. One other one, Greg, that I heard about from Chris DeVolder was that the live beans graph in Spring Tool Suite is also another interesting way of figuring out what actually gets created at runtime, and looking around for bean properties. Is that one you've ever tried playing with, or not really?
I have not worked with that one, but it does sound really interesting. They are putting a lot of effort over there. They recently added support to Spring Tool Suite if you use YAML for your application.yaml file. They've added support to basically help you auto-complete property settings.
Oh, that's right. Yeah. Some good stuff.
IntelliJ has support for that. So there's all kinds of support, and I take this as an opportunity to say, if you look in and understand what these auto-configuration things are, how they work, it can inspire you to go put some auto-configuration stuff into your own code.
Yep. Exactly. Or, maybe even contribute an auto configuration back to the community. Okay. Greg, thank you so much. This has been great. I learned a lot, even watching this for the second time. So great. If you want to join us for some of our upcoming webinars, we've got a bunch of cool stuff in the works. If you let's see, I'm just going to paste a couple of these links in the top of the chat window so you can get to them. I started off the presentation with a couple links about what's coming up, and I'm just posting them here now. So June 23rd, June 9th, and then again on June 30th. So please come back and join us. We're going to be having, let's see, I'm just trying to paste the last one in here. There we go. On the 9th, Erdem Gunne from Turkcell is going to be talking about a comprehensive kind of spring whirlwind tour. They got tasked to rewrite an application in an extremely short time frame, and did so quite successfully using Boot and a good chunk of the Spring IO platform. So this is going to be basically him talking about his experience at Turkcell, applying this stuff in anger, and great. He's just a great case study. I think it's really, really interesting to see how customers apply this stuff. On June 23rd, we're going to be talking a little bit more on Cloud Foundry. So if you're interested in things like Jenkins and continuous integration, continuous delivery, there's going to be a session on how Spring apps sort of work with continuous integration and Cloud Foundry, specifically with Jenkins from CloudBees. And then on June 30th, Phil Dutson's going to join us from Icon Health and Fitness. These guys were on the webinar program last year. Absolutely hilarious webinar. They talked about how they managed to create a shopping cart app in 24 hours using Spring. Totally ridiculous. Certainly not an architecture that even they would recommend, nor Pivotal would recommend. But the point is they did it. Like, it's just really, really funny talk. And they're going to be coming and joining us on the 30th, talking about how to just get off JSTL and use Timeleaf and just Java templating. Their experiences with Java templating in general. So cool. Last thing I just want to mention is, of course, this is being recorded. So if you want to, take this recording, share it with coworkers, bring it to your next brown bag lunch or your lunch and learn, whatever. Come, sign up for the Atom feed at spring.io/blog, and then you'll get a notification when the replay has been posted to YouTube. You'll also get all the great information that is written up in the blogs, Spring One replays, and all the awesome stuff that comes out on the Spring blog, including the webinar replay. And we'll have that and the slides available for you within 2 weeks. Often we get to it a lot faster than that. It just kind of depends, frankly. So last thing is just that, if you want to get your hands on Spring Boot bits, we have not really enabled HTTP downloads directly on purpose. It's just a horrible experience downloading HTTP directly. Really strongly recommend that you use Maven or Gradle. If you're on a military network or a closed network, or you don't otherwise have access to Maven Central, or you don't have your own local behind your firewall, Artifactory server, you can get HTTP downloads if you're absolutely desperate from repo.spring.io. We don't really make it super easy, but it is possible. So anyway, I put a note there if you're curious for more. With that, Greg, I just want to say thanks. That was awesome. Learned a lot. And any closing comments before we call it a wrap?
No, that was good. I hope to see everybody at Spring One this year.
Me too. Yeah, Greg's going to kill it at Spring One. We've got a pretty amazing lineup. So check out the website, Spring One 2GX, and register today. Make sure you do it before June 9th so that you don't miss the super early bird discount. And hopefully we will see you in Washington, D.C. Thank you very much, everyone, and have a great day. Bye-bye.